Well, it is a new year, and that means that, we reflect in this new year. We look forward. What will this new year hold? What are some things I want to do, accomplish, goals I'll set, resolutions that I will make, that this year I'm going to be the best version of me. And so maybe you've already thought about that, and maybe you're like most people, and it has something to do with your health. Maybe losing some weight, or eating better, or exercising more, or maybe it has something to do with your spiritual life. I would hope so, that you would set some spiritual goals about how you want to grow in your prayer life, or be more committed to spiritual community. Maybe it has something to do with getting your finances in order, or something to do with a relationship. Maybe you're going to get married in 2019. Congratulations to the McTavishes on the engagement of David. He'll be getting married this year to Kendall. Maybe it has something to do with finishing your education, or getting a degree, graduating from high school or from college. What do you hope to accomplish in 2019? Maybe you want to go somewhere. You have a goal to go somewhere. There's a destination in mind. But think about what you want to accomplish in 2019. And why don't you just turn to somebody next to you and tell them one thing you want to do in 2019. It could just be grow spiritually. It could be get your finances in order. It could be go to a particular place. But go ahead and turn to somebody, maybe somebody you didn't come with today, and say, here's what I want to do in 2019. I'll give you 30 seconds. Go. Okay, 30 seconds is up. 30 seconds is up. Very good. So we're getting to know one another, hopefully, learning our goals. Seems like some people are just thinking about this for the first time. Others of you came prepared to answer this question, it looks like. But I'd like for us to consider something together as we begin this year, something that maybe we could accomplish together, something that we could do together as a spiritual community. And have you considered in 2019 what it would look like to be ready for that day? That day, of course, I mean that day when Jesus will come again. What would it mean to be ready for that day? That day is a topic that is discussed all throughout the Bible. It's a significant day when Jesus comes again. And the fact that it's coming should make a difference in the way I live my life today. Right? When I experience loss because of that day, I should have hope. When I'm experiencing fear because of that day, I should have courage and boldness. When I have doubt because of that day, I should have direction. Because of that day, I should pursue holiness in a way that I wouldn't if that day weren't reality. That day is a topic that is explored in depth from the beginning of the Bible to the end of it. And it starts at the very beginning of the Bible in Genesis, where God describes, or the Bible describes, how God created this perfect world. This world where humans and God live together in harmony, and we work together to care for the planet. There was no sin, there was no rebellion, there was no death, there was no disease. Everything was perfect, and this is the way it was intended to be for eternity. But God gave man and woman choice, and they used that choice to decide to run the world in a different way, without God, to do things their own way. And so they rebelled against him, and they took over control of the planet. And they threw our planet into this broken state that we experience now, where now we have sin and rebellion and selfishness and greed and injustice and abuse and war and cancer and loss and death. And at the very beginning of the story, as you read it, God seemed to have a very short leash for all of this, because by the time we get to the 6th chapter of Genesis, he decides he's going to put an end to it. He wants to start over, and he's going to undo creation through this cataclysmic global flood. And he's going to wipe the earth clean, and he's going to start fresh and new with a family of supposedly, hopefully righteous people who would do it right this time. And so, of course, we have the story of Noah and the flood, and God kind of cleanses the earth of all of this sin and despair and disease and abuse and violence. But it's not long after the flood until we're just spiraling downward again. But this time, now as the story continues, while at times God seems to intervene into the story, at times he'll reward those who are living rightly, and at times he'll kind of punish those who are living unjustly and violently and rebelliously. For the most part, the storyline seems to be God takes this kind of hands-off approach, that the wicked kind of get away with their wickedness, and the good aren't rewarded really for the good lives that they're living. It seems to be this kind of backward planet. But all throughout the writings of the prophets is this heavy topic that they call that day, or synonymously we call the day of the Lord. And what the prophets say is that while it looks like God is not doing anything at this time to punish the wicked or to reward the righteous or the redeemed, the day will come. And that day has some common themes throughout the Bible, some things that all of the prophets seem to agree on about that day. And one of the things that they agree on is the fact that that day will be really good news for some people and really bad news for others. That on that day, those who are hard-hearted and unrepentant and rebellious will be judged and condemned. And on that day, the saved will be delivered and redeemed. So it will be good news, bad news. But notice the words I use there, because we're not talking about this being a day that will separate the good from the bad or the guilty from the innocent. Because according to the Bible, we are all guilty. All of us deserve to be condemned on that day because all of us perpetuate the broken state of our world. All of us have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. All of us have greed in our heart and violence in our heart and selfishness in our hearts. All of us want to do things our way. All of us have at certainly times lived our lives as though God doesn't even exist. We don't care for what he would want our lives to be like. We just do things our own way. But because of God's great love for us, he did not leave us in our rebellion, but he stepped into the midst of our brokenness, and he sent his only son, Jesus, to become a sin offering for us. And when he went to the cross, Jesus took all of our sin and all of the punishment of it and all of the shame of it and all of the penalty of it, and he took it with him to the cross. He took it with him to the grave, forever paying your and I's penalty for sin. So now what God tells us is that by faith, you and I can now receive the righteousness of Christ. And we can have a new story, a new history, as well as a new future because of what Christ has done, which means that when that day comes, when Jesus does finally return, we have a choice regarding which side we will be on, whether it will be good news or bad news. We can continue to harden our heart to him and refuse the gift he wants to give us, refuse the love he has continually showed us, and thus have that day be our day of judgment and condemnation. Or we can, by faith, receive the gift that Christ wants to give us and have that day be our day of deliverance and salvation, despite the fact we're all guilty. Let me give you one example of how this concept of that day is unpacked in the Old Testament. Zephaniah was one of the minor prophets. He lived in the 7th century BC. He was a prophet to the southern kingdom of Judah. He was somewhat of an urban prophet. He lived in the city of Jerusalem during a time when the people of God were living in a state of apostasy. They were rebelling against him. They were worshiping other gods. They weren't faithful to him. They were abusing one another. They were misusing the poor. They were being unjust to one another. They were violent. They were worshiping other gods in very despicable ways. But God didn't seem to be doing anything about it. And so there was a common theme in Zephaniah's time in Jerusalem that God didn't really care, that they could worship who they wanted, the way they wanted, that they could live the way they wanted, and there would be no consequences for their way of living. And it's into this way of thinking, and it's into this environment that Zephaniah begins to prophesy about this heavy, relevant topic of the day of the Lord, or that day. Consider what he writes in his 3rd chapter, verse 1 and 2. He says, "Woe to the city of oppressors, rebellious and defiled. She obeys no one. She accepts no correction. She does not trust in the Lord. She does not draw near to her God." Now, that could be written today. That could be written about the world in which we live. That could be written about me, certainly at times. The city of oppressors, rebellious and defiled, obeying no one, accepting no correction, not trusting God, not drawing near to God. But this is the context into which Zephaniah is writing. This is the way God's people are living. seemingly without consequence. And so Zephaniah speaks into this by telling them that it won't always be that way. Therefore, now this is God speaking. He says, therefore, because of this wickedness, because of this rebellious way that God's people were living, therefore, God says, wait for me. Now right here, this is a common theme of the day of the Lord, waiting. It's a now but not yet thing. God will bring his day, but we don't know when it will be. There's going to be some delay. There's going to be some wait. He's telling them in Zephaniah's day, 7th century BC, you're going to have to wait for it. And we're still waiting for it, right? There's this time period that we'll get to. But God says, therefore, wait for me, declares the Lord, for the day I will stand up to testify. So here we're introduced to what God is going to do on that day, and we have this language that's kind of taken from a courtroom. God's going to stand up to testify like you and I would do in a court of law. He's going to stand up as the witness, but he's also going to be the judge. And he is going to bring, he says, assemble all the nations to gather the kingdom. So in other words, this will be a day of global judgment. Everyone will be involved, all of the nations. And what will he do on that day? He will pour out his wrath on them, all his fierce anger. The whole world will be consumed by the fire of my jealous anger. So here's the bad news. God summarizes what he's going to pour out on the world by using these two words, jealous anger. Two words that can make God out to seem to be petty and vindictive, jealousy and anger. Those are two attributes that when humans have them, we seem to think that maybe they're immoral attributes. They're not good attributes, jealousy, anger. But the question is, are they always bad? Are they always immoral? Or is jealousy sometimes good and appropriate? And is anger sometimes good and appropriate? Consider this. If you're dating someone, you have a boyfriend or girlfriend, or you're married, you have a husband, a wife, and someone begins to pursue the object of your affection romantically, and the object of your affection begins to be attracted to that person who is pursuing them, what will you feel? Jealousy, yes? And would that not be the appropriate response, the appropriate emotion? This is not sinful or immoral to feel jealous when someone is pursuing someone you love. Or if someone tells you that you love, that you're committed to, a spouse says, I love you, but I want to date other people. I want to have other relationships. What will your emotional reaction be? Jealous anger is probably a pretty good description, and it would be appropriate. And this is what God has been dealing with for thousands of years. The one commandment he gives us, the highest of all commandments, is have no other gods before me. Worship the Lord your God with all your heart, all your mind, all your strength. And how appropriate it is for him to ask that of us, because who has loved us the way he has loved us? He has not only created us and given us life, he is not only sustaining our lives right now by giving us the air in our lungs and the heart beating in our chest. He not only provides every good thing in our lives, but more than that, while we were still sinners, Romans chapter 5 says that God demonstrates his love for us in this: while we were sinners, Christ died for us. That he stepped into our rebellion, took our punishment for us, and paid for our sin while we were rebelling against him. Who has loved us like this God? And so he can very appropriately come to us and say, put me first. If you really want to live, put me first. But for thousands of years, he's watched his people be unsatisfied with him and pursue life and satisfaction through false gods, other gods. We do the same thing today by pursuing every other god, thinking, well, maybe I could add this to God or put this over God, and my life will have more meaning. I'll have more significance, money or sports or entertainment or sexuality or identity or possessions or whatever those things may be. And this is what God is dealing with in the 7th century BC. A spiritually adulterous people. And so how appropriate that he would say to them, if you continue in this path, you will eventually receive my righteous anger, which is well deserved. But this is only half of the story of that day or the day of the Lord, because God goes on. He only takes like one verse to talk about the bad news, but then he goes on to talk about what else he will do on that day. He says, on that day, you, Jerusalem, will not be put to shame for all the wrongs you have done to me, because I will remove from you your arrogant boasters. Sing, daughter Zion. Shout aloud, Israel. Be glad and rejoice with all your heart, daughter Jerusalem. The Lord has taken away your punishment. He has turned back your enemy. The Lord, the King of Israel, is with you. Never again will you fear any harm. On that day, they will say to Jerusalem, do not fear, Zion. Do not let your hands hang limp. The Lord your God is with you, the mighty warrior who saves. He will take great delight in you. In his love, he will no longer rebuke you, but will rejoice over you with singing. So again, we see here this bad news, good news, that we can continue in our hard-heartedness and unrepentedness and our rebellion against him and suffer our own will. He will eventually say, your will be done. I tried to save you, but your will be done. Or we could simply receive this gift of love and grace and redemption that he wants to give us and have that be a day like no other day. Because on that day, he will not only sing over us with rejoicing, but on that day, you and I will be reunited with lost loved ones. On that day, you and I will be given new bodies where our eyesight doesn't go out on us and our bodies start to decay. On that day, we'll never have to say goodbye anymore because there will be no more death. You see, on that day, we're going to be not only reunited with one another, but we're going to be completely reconciled to God. We're going to be restored to the original creation where heaven and earth are together and man and woman and God are all together. And on that day, there'll be nothing separating you or I anymore. Because all of the things, the selfishness and the fear and the pride that separate us now will all be taken away on that day. And so in light of that day, that is sure and certain, is the last unfulfilled prophecy in the Bible. In light of that, we need to ask the question that in light of that day, how should I live this day? And so for the next 4 weeks, we're going to look at 4 different New Testament passages that discuss that day and give us the implications of what that should look like for us today. And to start with, I would like to look at a very familiar passage. If you spend any time around church, especially in Adventist church, you have heard this passage before. It's Jesus' teaching on that day, found in Matthew chapter 24 and 25, known as the Olivet Discourse. This is Jesus' longest teaching on that day. It's called the Olivet Discourse because he was standing on the Mount of Olives when he gave this teaching. But in this long teaching are many of the common themes that we find throughout the Bible of that day. For instance, Jesus says this, "Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then all the peoples of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory." So in other words, there's bad news, right? But then he gets to the good news. "And he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the 4 winds, from one end of the heavens to the other." So Jesus is talking about that day. He's saying, oh yeah, there's going to be bad news and good news. It's a day of judgment, but it's a day of redemption. But there's another aspect of that day that he brings out in this long teaching as he talks about signs of that day, as he gives parables about how to be ready for that day. He inserts in the middle of this long teaching this implication, this truth about that day that I'd like for us to start with to begin this series. And it has to do with the timing of that day. And this is what Jesus says to his disciples and to us through them. "But about that day or hour, no one knows. Not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. As it was," so he says, first of all, you can't know when it is. We don't know when it's coming. Now he's going to use an illustration to kind of unpack what that day will be like. And it's the flood is his illustration. "As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, up to the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. That is how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man." Again, this is a very common teaching throughout the Bible on that day. That while we know it's coming, we don't know when it's coming. That it's going to come at a time maybe when we least expect it. That many will be surprised at the fact that it's coming like they were in the days of the flood. Nobody was expecting it. They were eating and drinking and giving in marriage and just living life like it was going to go on forever, like there would be no consequence for the way they were living. And then that day came. And Jesus says that is the way it will be when he comes again. And he talks about the time aspect of that day because this whole discourse is in response to a question the disciples had asked. At the beginning of Matthew 24, Jesus had made a prophetic statement about what was going to happen in the future to Jerusalem. He said, "No stone will be left on each other," alluding to the fact that in 70 AD, 40 years after the crucifixion, the Romans would invade Jerusalem and completely level it. And Jesus told the disciples that would be coming in their lifetime. And in response to this prophecy that Jesus gave them, they ask a question. And the question they ask him is, when will this happen? They always want to know. Like we want to know, right? When will this happen? Give us a date. Give us a sure sign that we can know it's coming. When will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? This is a great question. I love this question, but this question makes an assumption that is a wrong assumption. The assumption is that the event Jesus just prophesied, the destruction of Jerusalem, and that day, when he comes again, will be the same day. That's what they're assuming. When will it be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? That this will be, this destruction of Jerusalem. They're putting it all together into one event. And Jesus knows it's not going to be one event. And he can very easily clear this up for them. He said, no, it's going to be like this, it's going to be this, and then that. He could have very easily given them like a list of 20 signs. Okay, first this is going to happen, and then that, all the way down to 20, so that we can kind of cross them off our prophetic list. So when we get to 18, we know just 2 more, and then he's coming. But he doesn't do any of that. For the next chapter, he's going to give all of these signs. And some of the signs allude to the destruction of Jerusalem that would happen in 70 AD. And some of the signs would allude to that day when he would come again. But most of the signs he gives are kind of cloaked in mystery. And most of the signs he gives are not signs of the end as much as signs of the age of the end. In other words, Jesus doesn't give a bunch of signs about what life will be like in the few days or few months or few years before he comes again. But he gives signs about what life will be like in the age of the end that would begin when he ascended back to the Father after the resurrection and would last until he comes again. So the age of the end, we could say, started in 30 AD when he ascended back to the Father and will go until he comes again. So we are living in the age of the end just as those in the first century were. And all these signs seem to be describing what it would be like living in the age of the end. So for instance, he says in verse 6, he gives a sign. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. So what do we know about wars and rumors of wars? They were happening in the first century, they happened in the second century, 5th century, 10th century, 15th century, they're happening now. Is the intensity increasing? Yes. But the fact is, it's not a sign of the end, but a sign of the age of the end. And that he could come at any time during this age, and that anytime we hear of wars and rumors of wars, it should remind us we are living in that age when Jesus could come again. That day could come, therefore we should be ready. Or another sign he gives in the very next verse, nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of birth pangs. Again, this is not the sign of the end, it's a sign of the beginning of the age of the end. And there are always earthquakes, and there are always famines, and there are always kingdoms rising against kingdom. As a matter of fact, if you put a list of most of the signs that Jesus gives us in Matthew chapter 24, you've got persecution of the righteous, false prophets, false teachers, famines, the gospel to go to the ends of the world. If you read the New Testament, all of these things were happening in the first century. The righteous were being persecuted. The church was being persecuted. You've got false prophets and false teachers. You have a huge famine in Jerusalem. That's a big topic of discussion. And Paul could say in his lifetime that the gospel had gone to the ends of the world. So it's no wonder that those Christians living in the first century believed that they were living in the very time when Jesus would come again, that he would come in their lifetime. And this is the way Jesus wanted it. This was by design. Jesus is not trying to confuse them. He's not trying to give them false hope, but he wants them to live in a state of readiness in the first century, in the second century, in the 5th century. So he gives them signs that they'll all be able to relate to. Because when we live in a state of readiness, it brings a focus to our lives. It brings a focus to our spirituality. It brings a readiness. And Jesus knows that a ready disciple is a faithful disciple. Because that's all he wants of us. He just wants us to be faithful to him. He just wants us to put him first. That's all he asks. And so he knows that when we're ready, we'll be faithful. You know, just about a week ago, Kim and I were taking this beautiful train ride through northern Italy along the border of Switzerland up into Switzerland. We were riding through the the Italian Alps. It's just beautiful scenery. And we heard of a legend of a villa that was right in that area where there is a gardener who keeps up the grounds just meticulously. It's a beautiful, beautiful villa with beautiful gardens. And the story goes that some tourists went there and were just awed at the beauty of this garden. They were talking to the gardener and they said, you're the owner of the place must really, supervise you quite a bit to have you take such great care of it. He says, actually, I've only seen him once in the last 15 years. They said, that's amazing that you would keep this place looking this good as though like the owner could come here tomorrow. And supposedly, the gardener said to the guy, oh no, not tomorrow, today. I keep this garden as though he could come back today. And that's the way Jesus wants us to live. He wants us to live this day as though it could be that day. Because he knows that a ready servant is a faithful servant. It brings focus. It brings clarity to life and to spirituality. But more than that, I think Jesus wants us and every generation to believe he's coming back in our generation. Because for all practical purposes, he does come back in our generation. Those first century followers of Christ who believed that he was coming back in their lifetime, are they still waiting? I mean, you may say, well, yeah, they are kind of, but not in their reality. They are in their graves and their lives are over. They ended in the first century waiting for Jesus, and the next thing that they're going to see is going to be the face of Jesus, and their next experience is going to be that day. Their eternity is sealed. And the same is true for every believer who has lived ever since then. Their fate is sealed. We often look back at past generations who had faith in the coming of Christ in their generation, especially as Adventists. We look back, how many generations? 5, 6 generations. And we hear from generations who knew Jesus was coming back in their generation. But they died still waiting. And we take that as a sign that like he's not coming, or we shouldn't wait for him, or we shouldn't be ready. We should see that as a sign of his great love for every generation, that he would give every generation signs so that they will be ready because their waiting is over. And the same is true for you and me. Jesus may delay that day for another 1,000 years. I doubt it, but he may. But you and I, we're not going to wait another 1,000 years. We have the rest of our lives, and then the waiting is over. And the day that we breathe our last, the minute we breathe our last, our eternity is set, our fate is sealed, and the next thing we'll see will be the face of Jesus. The next experience we'll have will be that day. And so Jesus wants us to live in a state of readiness, every generation. And so the first takeaway we could have about how that day should affect our lives today is that I should live this day as though it could be that day. Right? What would life be like if I lived this day as though it could be that day? What kind of focus would that bring? What kind of prioritization would that bring? What kind of boldness? How quickly would I be able to let go of hurts against me or offenses, right? And this is what Jesus is talking about all throughout Matthew 24 and 25. Again, just look one more time at this verse we already looked at. But about that day or hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, up to the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. That is how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. And so what would Jesus say should be the way we should live in light of that? He tells us just a few verses later, therefore, keep watch, because you do not know on what day your Lord will come. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known at what time of night the thief was coming, he would have kept watch and would not have let his house be broken into. So you also must be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him. So here's the reality. That day will come. That day is coming. For some, it will be a bad day. For others, it will be a day of deliverance and redemption. And you and I get to choose what that day will be like for us. The only reason we haven't experienced it yet is because Jesus wants every person to experience it as a good day. All I have to do is do like Jesus told his first century disciples, is to live like this day could be that day, to prioritize him, to have faith in him, to trust that he is who he said he is, that he did what he said he did, and that he will come as he said he would come. To live that day as though it could be this day. So I want to ask you, what would change in your life if you were to live this day as though it could be that day? Maybe it's nothing. Maybe you're already living that way. But maybe something would change. Maybe the way you spend time would change, or the way you spend money would change. Maybe the way you treat the people around you would change, or the length of time that you hold on to offenses against you. Maybe your sense of boldness would change. Here's a question I've been considering. If I were to live this day as though it could be that day, would that enhance my life or would it diminish my life? Would I live a fuller life if I lived this way? Or would I live a life that's more empty, missing out on some things? See, I am convinced that this is the key to life. That if I were to live this day as though it could be that it was that day, that I would have hope in the face of loss, that I have courage and boldness in the face of fear, that when I have doubts, it would bring this sense of direction, that it would lead me to love so much more unconditionally than I do now, that I would forgive so much more quickly if I were to live this day as though it were that day, that I would pursue holiness with a whole new perspective, and that most importantly, I would prioritize and pursue a relationship with Jesus that would bring life and vitality to my soul. And so on this first Sabbath of 2019, I want to ask you, what would it be like if we together lived every day this year as though it could be that day? And I want to ask you, like I do at the beginning, first week of every year, would you take some time to sit down and prayerfully consider how you are going to connect to Jesus and passionately pursue a relationship with him this year? You may be here and you've never considered a relationship with Jesus before, and you're like, well, maybe this is the year. I'm ready. I mean, what does that mean? How do I start a relationship with Jesus? You know, connecting to Jesus is all that he requires of us, but connecting to Jesus doesn't happen naturally. It takes some effort. And that's why every year we kind of encourage people to put together a plan and to write that plan down, because when we write it down, we're much more apt to do it than if we just think about it. And so we have this tool here at Newday that we use every year called our personal growth plan, where we just encourage people at the beginning of every year, put together some things that you're going to do this year that are going to connect you to Jesus in the next 12 months. And let me just encourage you to set aside a half hour or an hour or maybe a couple 10-minute blocks this week to kind of, and you can get one of these as you leave, and I'll email them out this week, but to put some things down about how you're going to grow in your relationship with him and add more life to your spiritual life. And let me just encourage you to consider at least 4 things to add to your plan this year that will help you live this day as though it could be that day. And number 1 is that we need to read and reflect on the Bible on a daily basis. The Word of God is one of the greatest gifts that we have, especially to live this day as though it's that day. Jesus continually talks throughout Matthew 24 about deception, right? And if I want to avoid deception, I need to know truth, and truth comes through his word, and I encounter God through his word. And there are so many ways to get his word into me these days with technology and apps and different Bible reading plans and reminders that come on my smartphone with this verse or read that. And so let me encourage you, if you don't already have a Bible reading plan for 2019, make a point to find one that will meet you right where you are. Whether it's reading a verse a day or a chapter a day or reading through the whole Bible 3 or 4 chapters a day, that you are daily reflecting on the Bible, asking yourself, God, what are you saying to me through this? What are you revealing to me about yourself through this? What are you asking me to do? How are you asking me to come into alignment with this truth from your word? Well, we need to prioritize the word. Maybe you want to join me in memorizing larger passages of Scripture in 2019. Maybe picking some favorite verses or chapters of Scripture that you're going to commit to memory slowly throughout the year to get God's word in you. But if we want, that's the number 1 way to grow spiritually and stay connected to Jesus, is to daily reflect on God's word. I'm going to ask you, would you consider doing that this year? Of course, number 2 would be to pray. Prayer is the engine that drives God's work in my life and in your life and in our church and in our world. And if there's one way all of us can grow, it is in our prayer life. I could grow in my prayer life. I pray regularly. God, teach me how to pray. I feel like I'm still a novice in prayer, but I believe so much in the power of it. And we have so many opportunities to grow in prayer right here at Newday. Every Monday morning from 6:30 to 7, we have our Monday morning prayer conference call. For years, we've been starting our week on Monday mornings by calling in on this conference call and praying, and all the details are in your bulletin today. You know, typically we have 5 people on the call. Some people just listen in, a couple people pray, but it's always a meaningful time. Wouldn't it be awesome if throughout 2019, as we live this day as though it could be that day, if we had 40 or 50 people on that prayer call every Monday morning, starting our week by praying together for one another, praying together for our world, for our country, for our church, for our mission, that we would pray together. I hope that you would incorporate prayer into your plan this year. More than that, that you would prioritize spiritual community. We can't connect to Jesus alone. We can't grow in Jesus in isolation. It's through community that we grow. And so that you would prioritize this gathering throughout 2019, that you would prioritize your small group throughout 2019. It's the author of Hebrews who said to not give up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing, but continue to encourage each other, and all the more as you see that day approach. But the closer we get to that day, the more we need one another, to encourage one another, to walk with one another, to continually love one another and correct one another. We need one another. And so would you prioritize spiritual community in 2019? And finally, would you make sure that you somehow, some way, look for ways to share your faith in 2019? Because that is the only reason why we have not yet experienced that day. The only reason we are still here is because our God is so incredibly loving and patient. And He doesn't want anyone to be lost. And you and I still have work to do. If you are one of the redeemed, if you have received Christ by faith, then He has work for us to do. And that is to share with those who have not yet met Him the incredible love that He has for them. That God is not counting their sins against them, but He has already dealt with them and just wants to welcome them. That heaven is open. I've thought about that day, and I imagine people on my block or in my workplace or in my school or wherever it may be, that as we get to that day and we announce, it's come, Jesus is coming, I imagine people coming to me and saying, you mean you knew about this and you didn't tell me? We have such amazing news that God is coming again to restore this lost planet. And so would you this year look for opportunity to build relationship with people far from God, to love people far from God, to pray for people far from God, to look for opportunity to say a word for Him, a word of truth. Be just a rabid inviter, inviting people, if you love your church, invite them to come and hear the gospel here, or to your small group, or to a service project, but that we would share our faith. Yeah, listen, this isn't rocket science, and it was never intended to be. These are things we all know. The only question is, will we prioritize them? Will we live this day as though it could be that day? Now, just a few months ago, I had a very sincere Newday member come to me and ask me a question. And I love this question, but they basically said, would you do a sermon series getting us ready for that day? Would you talk about how I could be ready for Jesus' coming? And I've had that question periodically throughout my ministry, and I love that question because it comes from a sincere heart, people who want to be ready for Jesus to come again. But also in that question is this belief that maybe there's some special knowledge that I need to be ready. But the only thing that I need to be ready is a connection with Jesus. The only thing I need to be ready is faith in Him and connection to Him through His Spirit. And so again, the question is, will I prioritize that connection and be ready through that connection? Could we enter into this year as though it could be our last year? That could be our last year as a planet. That day could come this year. Or it could be my last year as a person. And that day will come for me this year. And if I were, what would that look like? What would I do to be ready? What would I do to live this day as though it could be that day? Let's pray together. Our Father and our God, we want to thank You for the gift of Jesus that redeems us. We thank You for Your patience that has waited and waited for me and others in this room to receive the grace that you extend to us. And we know that you're still waiting. And so may we, God, live this year as though each day could be that day and prioritize our relationship with you and share this amazing message and this great news that you've given us. And may we see not only our hearts grow, but other people come to faith in you. And may this be the year, God, that we finally see our redemption draw near. May we see the face of Jesus. We pray it in his name. Amen.